In the last video, I talked a little bit about structuring our page by turning it into sections. Um, and sections may not be the right word, but we divided it up into parts. How's that? Um, and we said one part would be the header. All web pages have some kind of header, right? So we gave a div with an ID of header. And we put the main part of our page and we said it was a div with an ID of main. And we had a footer on our page and we made that a div with an ID of footer. And that gets done over and over and over again in the web. So what they did a few years ago is decide on creating some new HTML semantic elements. So what is a semantic element? Well, basically semantic means we're going to name it something that tells what it does. Okay, so these divs, we did it so much. Here's a div with an ID. Here's another div with an ID. Here's another div with an ID. Well, can't we shorten that? Can't we make it a little bit easier to understand? So they made some new selectors, some new tags. Okay, instead of doing div with an ID of nav and div with a class of header and div with an ID of footer, HTML said let's make some built-in elements for those things. So you can shorten it. So we can have a header by default. There's a header tag now. It still functions like a div. It still functions like a div. It's just a block that holds things. And in general, we put the header of our page inside header tags now, instead of a div with an ID of header. Same thing with our navigation, and we'll see that when we do some navigation in upcoming videos. But here are all the semantic elements they added. So a lot of pages have articles on them, so they made an article tag. It's just basically a specialized div with a nice name. They have a footer built in now. They have header built in. They have main built in. They have a nav section built in. They have a section in case you're doing different sections on your page. They have an article in case you're doing some kind of news publication, and you can have your articles each in their own article container. So these are all basically different kinds of containers. And a side would be like a sidebar that appears on a page, and we'll learn how to make those later. So now let's go back to our page and divide it up. Instead of using those divs, which we still use quite often, for these very common elements, let's use the semantic elements instead. And if you want to, you can come to W3 Schools and see all the different things. It describes each one of these elements in detail and what you should use it for. But let's go back to our regular page here. And instead of making this a div with an ID of header, I can shorten it and make it easier to read by just changing it to header. This is the header for my page. And down here I have /header. Still functions as a div. The difference being, back here, I don't have to call it a class or an ID anymore. I can just say, hey, there's the coding for my header. So the semantic elements are just specialized divs for structuring our page. Easy to read, easier to understand. When you see that in your code, you don't have to decode the IDs anymore. I know that's the header for my page. Messed something up when I applied it. Let's go back over to my page. Style, there's header. Did I save it? I hadn't saved it. There we go. So I don't have to use the ID and the pound sign anymore to format my header on my page. The same thing will happen. Div ID equals main. We can now just call this main. Down here at the end, we can say /main. Which also makes things easier. We end up having a lot of divs. So having the word main there lets me see what's actually ending, because sometimes you end up with a bunch of /divs in a row and you're never sure what goes with what. /main tells me it's the end of my main section. If I want to stylize my main section, I can just come over here and say main and give it a style of some kind. Not good to leave empty ones if you're not using it. No, I'm not using it right now. And then the other thing is footer. they created a dedicated footer tag. I'll put this down here and I can get rid of my div tag. So here's the beginning and ending of the footer for my page. Here's the main part of my page. And here's the header for my page. If I wanted to, I could make my hobbies. If I wanted to do something here, I could surround this. Maybe hobbies is an article. And I can put this down at the end of my hobby section. Here's the end of that article. And I'll highlight this and indent it a level because it's inside this article container now. So here's an article. It's got a heading and a paragraph inside. And I called it an article. Does it change anything on my page? Not at all. It just gives me some structure to the page. If I want to apply some special formatting to this article, I can go over to my CSS sheet, make an article selector, and apply it. So that's the semantic web. Using specially named classes, header, footer, article, name, main, to designate parts of our pages to make them easier to manage. So when you create a web page, you should think about that structure before you create the page. And I would highly suggest, rather than doing what we did here, when you create a new page, start out by creating the header section, the main section, the footer section, and maybe a nav section when we learn about navigation. Do the structure first before you start putting elements inside of it. It'll really help you out. It helps organize your page and helps you keep track of what your code is doing.